All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's talk, which is part 6 of our 8-part series titled From Berkeley to Berlin. A reminder that today's talk is being recorded. If you missed parts 1 through 5, those are available for you to view on our the LISA website under the author series page. For those of you who are joining from the WebEx, please enter your questions for Tom into the Q&A field. We will ask those during the Q&A session on your behalf. For those of you in person, please wait to ask your questions into the microphone so that our guests in the virtual WebEx can also hear your question as well. And then a reminder that Lisa is holding a drawing for a chance to win a copy of one of Tom's books, and the winner will be notified after the talk. So please join in welcoming Mr. Tom Ramos.
Thank you, Colin. Good afternoon. All right, for those of you who have made it up to here, lecture number 6, psychologists have a name for you. You are called masochists. But welcome, and hopefully we'll keep this going, and I'll keep you going for at least, we got 6, 7, 8, so we got 3 more to go. But this is going to get very exciting. We're going to come to the exciting climax of this story about how this laboratory got started back in 1952. Now, last week we talked about, there was 3 successive failures that the laboratory went through. After it was created, there was a lot of infighting in Washington and elsewhere, whether or not to create a second laboratory and how badly it was needed. There was fear that the Soviet Union was going to have a hydrogen bomb without the United States having one, and all those big fights went on. And then Lawrence agreed with a commissioner from the Atomic Energy Commission that, yes, he agreed another laboratory was probably needed. And basically, they built it around Lawrence's RAD lab in Berkeley, and they extended it out to Livermore, which had a naval air station, which was being mothballed after World War II. And Berkeley was called Site 100, and then they called this new site out here in Livermore Site 200. And so morale was not all that great, but after the 3rd test, there were some significant individuals. Isidore Rabi was a Nobel laureate, but he was also member of the General Advisory Committee with the Atomic Energy Commission, and he was openly stating in GAC meetings, where are the new ideas? Where's all the bravado? This is a huge waste of money. The director at Los Alamos was suggesting that the Livermore ought to become a subsidiary to Los Alamos and go back to doing diagnostics for Los Alamos test. And things were very serious. And so in the midst of this, Art Beale was basically leading what they called the small weapons group, the atomic bomb group, basically, for those 2 tests into the 3rd test. And he was extremely talented, and we're going to see, he's going to show up a little bit more, but he had it leading this effort. Now, these were led by by Edward Teller's ideas for eventually a thermonuclear device. And Beale was following Edward's guidance, as everyone else was. But as the group leader for the Ruth and Ray shots, I think he was feeling the pressure, and he just stepped out. He said, I'm not in management. I don't want to be part of this anymore. And later, about a year later, he would take a very high-paying job in South California, down in the Los Angeles area, along with another prestigious individual named Ernie Martinelli. 2 of them would take off, so it was a big loss. But anyway, Beale leaves, and so Herb York has to come up with a person to lead the group for the next round of test to design an atomic test. And I can imagine, I wasn't there, but I can imagine York talking it over with Lawrence. And another presence that tended to be out here a lot was that later Nobel laureate Louis Alvarez. And I can easy to believe that Louis Alvarez and Ernest Lawrence would suggest, why don't you use Johnny Foster? Foster was in the Sherwood project at the time, which was the only energy project going on at the lab. It was headed up by the physicist Dick Post. And Johnny wasn't happy. It wasn't not his brand of physics, basically. It was mostly dealing with plasma physics. Johnny was more into nuclear physics, and it wasn't his cup of tea. And he spoke with Jim Carruthers, who later would become an associate director of the lab and the laboratory historian. And Carruthers went to York and said, well, we need a place to find for Johnny. And this was all happening around the same time. So the timing was right. And Herb York then asked Johnny to take over the small weapons group, or the small atomic group. I forget the exact name now. And Johnny agreed, and he took it over. And with the new change of organization, York gave the group a new name. He called it the Hectaton Group, which is the counterpart to Harold Brown's Megaton Group. The Megaton Group would be designing the secondaries, your thermonuclear secondaries. The Hectaton Group, hecto is Greek for 100, so instead of 1,000,000 tons, 100 tons, would be your atomic device design group. And so that gets its start. Now, meanwhile, I mentioned also last week, after the stress of testifying at the Oppenheimer hearings, where Oppenheimer had lost his Q clearance, and he was fighting to get it back, and the main witnesses against Oppenheimer were the Berkeley Livermore crowd. And Teller got so stressed out, he was basically ostracized by the American physics community. He kind of left the scene, but nevertheless, he would get in, and he would get word back into the lab, and he was still pushing on his ideas. And he still wanted to do a hydride device like a Ruth Ray, another hydride device like that. And he wanted to do yet another Kuhn event device. He had some names for it. Sirius was a bigger model than the Kuhn device, and Companion was a smaller one. And he was still pushing for these to go on. So things seemed to be going on the way they had been, which was not very good up to this point. But right in the midst of this now, Johnny Brown meets with Harold Brown, so the two weapons group leaders essentially take over the weapons program of the laboratory. Remember now, Lawrence and Teller are hospitalized with colitis attacks. Herb York has come down with a bout of with valley fever. And so they get together and they write what I call a manifesto, but it's a document. And they outline their plans for the future. And in no uncertain terms, they say, all right, we're going to abandon the path taken by Edward. We're going to actually go out on our own and design brand new types of weapons. And so there won't be any more hydrides. There won't be any more Kuhn-like devices. These are going to be new. And Brown, he went over and he did an evaluation of what had happened. And in the Operation Castle in 1954, Los Alamos clearly established their ability to make hydrogen bombs. I mean, they had 5 very successful tests, but these were large devices. They were multi-megaton devices. And Brown set a course that what the laboratory is going to go after would be a smaller device, still up in the megaton range, but a much smaller, physically smaller device if we could develop something of that size. And this also is in line with the military analysts that were here from RAND. The RAND Corporation fellows were here. Remember the Bill Kaufmans, Herman Kahns? They were pushing the physicists here at the laboratory, if you're going to design a weapon that's going to be extremely valuable for a future nuclear deterrent, it has to be small to make it much more survivable, so it can fit on more things than just large bombers. And so Brown lays out the strategy. He says, that's what we're going to go after. We're going to go after a megaton type device, but much smaller than has ever been used before. And then Foster, at the same time, he announces what his initiatives are going to be. First, it was called a highball, but it was another hydride device, and it was obviously being pushed on him by Edward, and it got on the list, but very quickly, Foster then dropped the hydride devices. He said, I've had it, that's not a good idea to pursue, which is quite a show of independence for a very young man in the laboratory. Then there were 2 other ideas. One was called a gun. It was not a gun-like device like we had at Los Alamos, but it was called a gun. And that was one choice. And the other one was a device called the geode. And this goes back to Art Beale and Ernie Martinelli, the 2 gentlemen I talked about a little bit earlier, who left the group. They were still at the laboratory. They were still working. And they had this idea for a futuristic atomic bomb. And they had this idea way back about a year or 2 earlier. And it was way ahead of its time. But it was exciting. It was brand new. It was revolutionary. And so Foster really he said, this is something that's also worthwhile investigating. So he kind of basically had two things. But eventually he gets down and he drops the Celeste because he's not in for hydrides. He really wants to pursue the geode. That's where his heart was. but I'll go into in a second. But he couldn't, we didn't have the wherewithal to support that type of design. We didn't have the computer codes to back it up, and we also didn't have testing facilities that were badly needed to also help with that. And so they eventually settled on the gun device, which will be given a name called Clio. Now, Johnny Foster, let's go take a step back here. Let's talk about Johnny Foster. Johnny's born in 1922 in New Haven, Connecticut, right near the University of Yale, because his father is an assistant professor of physics at Yale. And his father is a native Canadian, came over to the United States before World War I, worked at Bell Laboratories in New Jersey. When World War I broke out, he joined the American Army, and while in the American Army, he's stationed at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, and he develops, this sounds to me quite incredible, but this is back in 1917, he develops drones. He takes these biplanes and he outfits them to fly by themselves, just like drones. And this is at the birth of aircraft. Foster was one hell of a physicist. He got his PhD in a thing called the Stark effect, which is a quantum mechanical effect, which is an extremely difficult thing to measure. And he did measure it, but he measured it to such exquisite accuracy that it won the attention of Niels Bohr, father of the atom, and also Werner Heisenberg, who invented quantum mechanics at the time. And they all became friends. So he was already at a very young age world-renowned. And then because he joined the Army in World War I, he won his citizenship, and he competed for a national fellowship after the war ended, and he won it. And with the money from the fellowship, and also from a fellowship he got from Alfred Loomis, that's a character I mentioned a couple of lectures ago, that money he used to go to Yale University and he got his PhD. And after that, he stayed there and he became an assistant professor of physics. And while he was there, a graduate student arrived by the name of Ernest Lawrence. And Lawrence and Foster became very close friends. And part of the reason for that, I believe, is the two of them were exquisite experimentalists. I think I mentioned earlier, Lawrence was one of the best experimentalists in the world. He was able to do extraordinarily exact measurements like Planck's constant and other things. And the same way that Foster had discovered some of the nuances with the Stark effect. So they were kindred spirits, and they became very close friends there. In fact, I hypothesized myself, I can't prove it one way or another, but Johnny Foster was born around this time, and I was wondering, easily Lawrence could have become Johnny Foster's godfather. The network of friends was that close. But soon after that, Foster gets an offer to become an associate professor of physics at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. And he accepts it. So he goes back up, it's a nice promotion, goes back up to McGill as an associate professor. So Johnny comes along and he grows up in Montreal. And the house they have, it's a nice house right off from McGill University. Across the street, there's a city park. It's a big city park, kind of like a Central Park, kind of big park. And the kids, or someone, had decided to make a mound of dirt, and they put up a mound of dirt, about 5 or 6 feet high. And then in the wintertime, when you had all the snow, or if you put your skis on, came down a hill, and you hit that mound of dirt, you can leap over it, and you could ski jump. You could ski jump off this mound. And you can imagine Johnny as a little kid playing with it, and that was, of course, that would attract kids, like honey would attract flies, and boom, all the kids would be jumping off this little mound that was built. Johnny stayed with it, and over the years, he got better and better. And that's a picture of him there in the lower right, and that's in the Montreal City Championships for ski jumping. And that's Johnny Foster himself, and he won the city championships that year. Later on, he'd set a record for a North American ski jump at an event held at Dartmouth University. So he was an athletic kid, really good at it. Then World War II hits. Johnny was attracted at that time. He really had this affinity for aircraft. He wanted to join the Royal Air Force, help England defend itself against the Luftwaffe. But Lawrence calls up, and he calls his old friend back, and he says, I need you badly. I'm creating a laboratory at MIT, the MIT Radiation Laboratory. We're going to develop radar to support the Allies in World War II. And so John Sr. immediately says, okay, fine. picks up his family, and they move out of Montreal, and they show up in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And so John Sr., actually, he will win patents. He'll be inventing things for radar while he's there. In the meantime, he takes Johnny and he enrolls him. Johnny, by this time, is a sophomore at McGill University. He's a college student. And he enrolls Johnny in the Harvard Research Laboratory, where Johnny also starts picking up doing research on radar while he's there. But after 1 year, Johnny decides he wants to contribute to the war effort, and he goes and he volunteers to become a technical advisor to the United States Army Air Corps. And he does. And they accept him, and next thing you know, he's on his way to the European Theater of Operations, to the war in Europe. I think earlier in a lecture I mentioned how he's on a convoy, he's crossing the Atlantic. The navigation system breaks down on the ship he's on, and he fixes it, and they continue on, make it into the Mediterranean, and Johnny is assigned to the 15th Air Force in Italy. When he's there, he makes it a business of talking to the crews after they come back from missions, and he'd sit down and get out briefings. What happened? How did the Germans react? How did they know where you were going? And this was extremely dangerous. This is one of the most dangerous jobs in the military in World War II. 1 out of 3 individuals in those units, the 8th Air Force and 15th Air Force, will be killed. It's one of the most dangerous jobs they had. And half of these military people are teenagers. They're 19-year-olds coming in and going into extremely dangerous situations. Johnny goes to the commander and asks him, do you have any German radar sets you got that I can study and figure out? And they finally found one. It's called a Würzburg radar set. And then they gave him that sergeant. You see the lower picture, that's Sergeant Burrell. They give him a sergeant to help him, a tech sergeant. And the two of them take apart the Würzburg unit and figure out how it works, what frequencies it's operating on, what its range could be. And when they put it back together, and Johnny then goes and he comes up with a set of plans himself. And that picture shows him giving briefings to bomber crews in 15th Air Force in Italy about tactics you should be doing that would outwit the German radar or make your survival a lot safer, if you will. And within a month or two, when the crews start picking up on Johnny's suggestions, their casualty rate drops by 50%. It's quite an accomplishment. He saved many, many lives with that. The commander of 15th Air Force even put Johnny in for the Silver Star, which he almost got, but the war ended by the time the paperwork was coming through. And so Johnny came back to Montreal. He went back to McGill. He's the captain of the gymnastics team, and he's elected to go to the Olympics in 1948, represent Canada in the Olympics as a gymnast. But there was a shortfall of funding, so that didn't happen. But then he graduates, he's second in his class. He gets a job at the Chalk River Heavy Water Plant, nuclear reactor, and he's there. And then his father is corresponding with Lawrence and said, hey, Ernest, my son's ready to go for a PhD. And Ernest says, hey, bring him out here, send him out here. I'll be happy to take him. And so Johnny then is accepts a position at the Rad Lab. He's just gotten married, and he's a sporting fellow. He owns a Black Shadow, which is a British motorcycle. It's kind of a Harley Davidson of the Brits. Really sign of the times. He puts his new bride, Bobby, in the back of the motorcycle, and he drives from Montreal to Berkeley, California, all through his summer. And that's their honeymoon. And he arrives, and he joins the Rad Lab. His group leader is Louis Alvarez, so he joins Louis Alvarez's group, and goes and gets his PhD. And at the same time then, now back to the story, York now appoints him as the head of the Megaton Group, and Johnny has to put these disheartened guys, they just had 2 atomic failure tests, and put them all together, get the morale going up again, and get them to work. In his group, he has some talented theoretical physicists for backup. Ernie Martinelli, who I mentioned a little bit earlier, he's advising the group. But his big theorist is a man named Jim Wilson, who is extraordinarily talented theoretical physicist, comes in and bursting with ideas, incredibly good at developing codes and such. And Wilson becomes basically kind of the theoretical brains behind the group. Then for code support, for writing all the computer codes that they're going to need, Bob LeLevier is put at the head of that group, and there's some very talented physicists also join that group. I mentioned there in small print Mark Wilkins, who will later work with Jim Wilson, and they will invent a hydrocode. These hydrodynamic codes are called hydrocodes, and they will develop one that will last for decades. It was used by the laboratory for decades. It was so well written. So he has a pretty talented set, and then his designers, I have the names up there. These are energetic, very young people, untested, and they're going to go out and they have to design a brand new type of atomic device. And that's their challenge. And so now he's down, he's going to do this gun-like thing. It's not remember, it's not a gun assembly weapon, but they call it the Clio. It's revolutionary. It's the first time I saw diagrams of this thing, I said, what the hell are they thinking? It was extremely different than anything I'd seen before, but they were putting it together, testing it. Johnny set up some test facilities at Nevada. Also, Duncan McDougall's division at Los Alamos lent in and started providing Johnny with hydro tests to support the development of his weapon. The geode I brought up, he wanted badly to do it, but he just, again, did not have the codes to support it and that. And I remember I had conversations with Johnny later. Even to this day, he's ruining the day. I wanted to really go after the geode. I really wanted to go after the geode. But it really was not a wise move. Remember, his group had 2 successive failures. If they go out again and do one more failure, that's the end of it. There won't be any more group. So he had to be somewhat conservative. He had to succeed in that first test. There wouldn't be another test after it. So they developed in this Clio, and one of the things driving him too is he always remembered the little guy, if you will, and the Army was calling for some sort of nuclear artillery type of weapon to support them in a future war because of the devastating attacks they witnessed during the Korean War. And Johnny put that to heart. So they're putting together the Clio. The next, in 1955, it's Operation Teapot. And they're pretty conservative in the way they're piecing together this weapon. So conservative that when they're finally finished with the final configuration, someone came up with a concern, well, I'm not sure this thing is close to being critical, just the way it is. And when it goes together, it may become critical. Now, when it becomes critical, that doesn't mean you're going to have an atomic explosion. What it does mean is you'll have a sudden excursion of neutrons that would burst out from the criticality. Anybody nearby would be badly injured by the neutrons coming out. So the theorists were going in, they had the computer calculations, and they went with the engineers, and they said, well, is it safe or not? Well, it looks pretty close. It's government work, probably close enough for government work, which is not good if you're the person out there putting this together, because the reason why their concern was that once you get it together, maybe it's still subcritical, but as you're putting the screws on and you have your hands around it, neutrons could hit your hands and bounce back into the device. It's another surface to bounce back the neutrons. And the question was, if those added neutrons going in, were they enough to make it go critical and therefore injure the very person who's around that device tightening it? So they didn't want to trust the codes that much, and Myron Knapp was the engineer responsible for assembling the Clio. So he came up with an idea to test if it's safe to put it together in a tower in Nevada. And he took some ready money, cash, and went downtown Livermore to Kelly's Butcher Shop, which is right across the street from what's now the Donut Wheel. There's a Kelly's Butcher Shop there for years. And bought 10 pounds of round ribs and came back. And to mimic the hands of the technician that would be putting the device together, he took the ribs, the spare ribs, and he wrapped them around the device, each half. Then they converted this conveyor belt kind of contraption so that remotely they could have the 2 halves come together with the spare ribs on them. And when they came together, they'd be locked together just as though they were for real on a test. So they put it all together. They did the experiment, came together, and it didn't go critical. And so everyone was happy, good to go. So they took it back and they put them inside. They built these reinforced Samsonite suitcases, and they put both halves of the Clio into that. if you weren't into the spare ribs, well, Myron Knapp kept them, and he took them home that night, and he gave it to his pet dog. So his pet dog got a nice meal of spare ribs that night. That's where I got that from Brett Knapp, who was Myron's son, and for a while was our laboratory director. And he says, Tom, I remember that night when my father came in with all the spare ribs. I had no idea where they came from, but the dog enjoyed them in any case. So then, now they got to get it to Nevada, and this is really the improvisation at its best. So they got the two halves in these Samsonite suitcases, and they had a summer worker, an intern from San Jose State University. His name is Tommy, and he has a Polish last name. I'm sorry, I don't know his last name. It's hard to pronounce. But Walt Arnold, who had responsibility for getting it out to Nevada, takes Tommy. He says, Tommy, go in and you'll see two suitcases. Pick up the suitcases and put them in a station wagon. They had a Woody station wagon sitting there. And so Tommy goes in, he picks them up and puts them into the station wagon. Then Arnold gives him a .45 caliber Army pistol and hands it to him and says, now, don't let anybody touch the suitcases. Guard them. He's yes, sir, kind of thing. So he has it. And that was security in 1955. But this is what nuclear security looked like in 1955. So, and there's a precious picture in the top. That's Tommy enjoying a ham and cheese sandwich for his lunch. And he's using the Clio as his lunch table as he's sitting in the back of the station wagon. Then they go out, they leave Livermore in the station wagon. They travel out to the Nevada test site. At there, they switch it over to that government sedan, which is what you see there. And there's Tommy now transferring the suitcases in there. And they get it up, they put it up onto a tower, and they're ready to go for the thing. Now, what's interesting is Time magazine had an article around this time saying that the United States had come up with a mysterious new atom bomb that can be carried in a suitcase. And I'm wondering, there you're looking at it there. Well, now back on the other group, that's the Hectoton Group. With the Megaton Group, that's led by a young man named Harold Brown. Brown is a product, he came from a middle-class Jewish family in New York City. He was extremely bright, and New York City had magnet school. They have 3 magnet high schools. There's the Bronx School of Science, there's Peter Stuyvesant, and there's Brooklyn Tech. And these are highly competitive high schools to get into, but people, students really fight like hell to get in, and once they're in, then they have this really tough regiment that they go through. But it's worth it. In the Bronx School of Science alone, just that one high school has 5 of its graduates won Nobel Prizes. So it's really elite type of student body that you have going to this place. And Harold Brown goes there and he graduates a little bit early, and then he goes to Columbia University, and by the age of 21 he has a PhD in physics. He's extraordinarily bright, and he's bright future, looking forward to a bright future. And he decides to go out to the rad lab. He wants to work with Lawrence on advanced nuclear physics experiments. He's an experimentalist himself. And he goes out, and then he gets a job, and they assign him, when he arrives out at the rad lab, to work with Herb York to design targets for the MTA, that accelerator that showed up at Livermore. And so Brown is busy doing that. When they create the laboratory, York, who's extremely close friends with Brown, asks him to take over the Megaton Group to lead the effort to design a secondary for a thermonuclear weapon. And Brown does that. So Brown's in this group. Now, unlike the Hectoton Group, which relies quite a bit on testing, high explosives testing to initiate an atomic explosion, with the Megaton Group, now you have to take the energy from an atomic explosion and use that to implode and to create a thermonuclear blast. And so you can't do that in the laboratories or at any test facility. So you're heavily reliant on computer codes. It's the only way you can mimic, model, and do your work is through computer codes. And so it's really heavily stressed there. So to support the group, the Megaton Group, Mike May ran a small subgroup called the Radiative Transport Group. And Mike's members are there. They're pretty, I mentioned Bill Grassberger in an earlier lecture. He was a member. Roland Herbst, who would later become A Division leader. Bill Lockey, another outstanding icon of the early years of the laboratory. I think it's Mike Schultz. Anyway, they got some really first-class model makers or computer code makers working with Mike May. And then there were the designers themselves working together. Louis Henier is that professor from Berkeley, the astrophysicist. You had Pete Moulthrop, George Mention, John Knuckles, Dave Hall, Jim Tracy, Ken Bintel, others. These are all young, very young individuals, all untested, but they're coming in to design a thermonuclear warhead in their 20s. Okay, there's the group putting together. Oh, and then finally in backup, Jack Rosengren had a lot of administrative support, and then he used Carl Hausman. He came to the laboratory from the Matterhorn project, John Wheeler's Matterhorn project. Hausman, again, came from the military. He was an Army officer. And Brown used him also as a manager because Hausman had that rare quality for a physicist that there actually is a time limit. When you get a goal, you are supposed to get it done by a certain time, which seems to be difficult for some physicists to digest. But Hausman understood it. His Army experience helped. And so Hausman was also kind of a taskmaster, keeping people on time to get the job done. All right, so that's their team. And what are they going to design? I talked about Johnny Foster coming up to Clio. Now, for the secondary, which is the also important secondary, remember this is has to be a thermonuclear weapon. Herb York, when he worked back with what was called the Measurements Group, and he met with Edward Teller at Eniwetok when they were preparing for a thing called the George event back in 1951. And Edward went up to a blackboard and he drew his idea for a thermonuclear warhead weapon, which would become the Mike device. And York got it, he understood it, but he realized that this thing required really a thick case, a huge thick case, inches of heavy metals like lead, which made it very heavy, very cumbersome. And he put in his mind, I wonder if there's a better way to do this than to have big, heavy cases that surround these things. And so he worked on an idea of, well, what if we did away with that? And he brought it with Harold Brown. So Harold Brown and Herb York, they sat down together, cloistered themselves, and they came up with a new idea for a thermonuclear weapon. And this will be called the Linda. And I can't go into the details, obviously, but basically what they did was they took the Teller-Ulam idea and they turned it inside out. Best way I can go without going to jail is to tell you that. The thing with what they did, though, was it is much more complicated to figure out how this thing is still going to work without the case, keeping everything together. And so that relies a lot on calculation, your calculation abilities, and you have to trust your computer codes. You have to trust all those computer calculations you're doing, because this is extraordinarily complicated. It's way too complicated than try to figure out in your mind how the radiation channel is going to work, or this, that, and the other thing. Because nothing is constant. It has to be constantly changed depending on how far it is away from this thing, or what kind of other materials it is, and this thing and that thing. So they put together a team. Have members of Art Beal and Ernie Martinelli, the two gentlemen I talked about that worked with the Ruth and Ray shots, but they joined this team. Another talented physicist named Jim Frank and Mike May, our good friend Mike May, comes in, and they put together and they do intensive work on calculations, and they come up with a new device which they call Linda, the Linda device. It's much lighter than your standard. If you go back and look at the devices that went off in Operation Castle in 1954, this thing is a fraction of the weight. Smaller and lighter, which is in line with, as I mentioned, Harold Brown's idea was we need to make these things much smaller because the Rand Corporation guys are saying we need to make these things much smaller. And so it is. It falls within that, and they have to come up with something that will work. That's the other thing that amazes me, is I want to remind you, this is right after the Kuhn event. This is 1 year after the Kuhn event, which was an absolute disaster. Nothing worked on the Kuhn event. And we were the laughing stock of the physics world. And these guys had better come up with something that's going to work, or that's it. You don't get a second chance. The laboratory was shut down as a bad idea. Good try, but didn't work. So this thing has to work. And what kind of got to me is they didn't take the safe way out. They didn't take some device that had worked already. Los Alamos had a successive string of successful tests. They could have borrowed some idea from that, kind of mop it up a little bit, and just do it again and get everybody off their back. Okay, we got a successful test, so let's go on. They didn't do that. This is extremely revolutionary, It's brand new. And it's dramatically different than anything ever seen before. So they take the Linda out to the Nevada test site. They're going to use the Los Alamos primary to drive it, because at that time there were no Livermore atomic bombs or primaries that they could rely on to drive this thing. So they used the Los Alamos primary, and they worked with Los Alamos to put this thing together in that way. All right, so they go out to test it, and the Clio goes up first. It's in March. They put it up on the tower. There were no neutron excursions. Nobody died screwing it into the tower. And it went off on the morning, and it worked perfectly. And I have a picture there. The armed forces, especially the Army and the Marine Corps, had a thing called Desert Rock. It was an Operation Desert Rock. And the idea was to introduce soldiers to a nuclear environment, because they thought the next war we're going to have atom bombs. And so you might as well see it now. It's typical military thinking. If you've not been in the Army, you don't know what I'm talking about. If you were in the Army out there, you know exactly what I'm talking about. We got to practice misery. But anyway, so they're out there. They got to experience a nuclear test. And so you're looking at Operation Desert Rock, some of the soldiers. And for the Clio, they were out there. In fact, I remember I interviewed one of the individuals who was actually out there. His trench, you can see the trench they're sitting in with the sandbags. In his case, his trench caved in. The shock of the explosion caved in. He had to dig his way out of the trench. But anyway, the Clio worked. And Johnny was so excited that, forgetting all about protocol or everything, he went above Herb York's head, if you will. But he calls Ernest Lawrence directly up at his house back in Berkeley. And he tells him the good news. He said, "Sir, it worked. It worked." And Lawrence was so excited, he just said, screw the colitis. He gets out of bed, boom, gets in a car, comes out to Livermore, tries to get a briefing there. There's no one there. And as Dale Nielsen, who was on duty at the time, he just walked up and down the hallway of the main building of the laboratory. He said, "Isn't this great? Isn't this great?" He was that excited. Next morning, he catches a flight out of Oakland, goes through Los Angeles, then Las Vegas, gets driven up to the test site, and then he gets a full briefing. And he pulls his whole team together. So he has Johnny Foster, Herb York, Harold Brown, Edward Teller, and he gets them all, and they're walking around outside the control point, and he says, "What's next?" And they all agree. He got them all to agree. This is what we're going to do. We're going to make small nuclear weapons. That's our mission. We're going to make these things that they'll work, and they'll be smaller. 2 weeks later, it's now Harold Brown's turn. And they take the Linda up on a tower, and they set it off, and it goes out. It gives a yield within a few percent of what they had predicted, which is phenomenally successful. That's incredible. So this revolutionary device, there was nothing like it before it, nothing like it. And it worked to within a few percent of what they calculated it would do. It was a phenomenal achievement, frankly. And remember Brown, in one of his monthly progress reports that the laboratory sent to the Atomic Energy Commission, I remember reading in one of them, Brown said, if this idea works, it will have a great effect on the way we design thermonuclear warheads in the future. And I can't imagine how pressing he was, because once the Linda went off, then basically everything before it was obsolete. No one would go back to the old way, because these things were much more lighter, much more efficient and workable and survivable. So 2 great successes. We went from rock bottom last week, 3 successive failures, to now 2 incredible successes. And people got off their backs calling for them. All right, so there's no more calling, let's shut down the lab. No more of that talk anymore. There's now kind of a recognition that these people did know what they were doing. As part of the recognition, the Atomic Energy Commission then created Sandia Livermore, and they opened up another branch of Sandia Laboratory. At that point, the only branch was in Albuquerque. Now you had a Sandia branch in Livermore to service the Livermore laboratory, just as much as the Albuquerque operation was servicing Los Alamos. And within a year, they arrive in '56. Bill Marsh takes over one of the barracks buildings at the inside the laboratory, and Bob Barton becomes a group leader working with the design physicist. And within a year, they will put together the first stockpiled warhead to come out of Livermore, the W-27. So it was very timely, and they made their presence known very quickly. And a sign of their success, by 1958, there would be 1,000 employees of Sandia Livermore. And of course, then they'll move across the street, they'll move across East Avenue, establish their own campus across the street to support this laboratory. It was a great success. And the other thing is Y-12, remember that's where our calutrons were in World War II. And so many of the physicists at Livermore had served in the Y-12 plant during the war, and there was a connection between the two. And that connection survived. And so in the early 1950s, Livermore would send several people down, several engineers, down to Y-12 plant, which was developing itself into being a national leader to create diagnostic and mechanical engineering equipment. And at the same time, Y-12 would send people into Livermore, and there was a constant exchange of ideas. And so that became a really good collaboration of itself. And finally, the Atomic Energy Commission then also authorized Livermore to have its own high explosives test facility. Now you had Berkeley, remember, Site 100, Livermore, Site 200, so the new place will be called Site 300. And they choose a remote place up in the Altamont Hills, just east of here, off Carl Howell Road. It's a great bike ride if you want to take your bicycle up there. It's a good bike ride, go up and down into the Altamont. Anyway, it's pretty remote. And now the physicists and the engineers, we now have our own hydrotest facility, hydrotest or hydrodynamic testing, which is when you take high explosives and you put together models of your device and test it actually. This is a huge advantage. Immediately it goes into overdrive, and Site 300 is being used double shifts. And true to word, within a month, the first traffic ticket is given at Site 300. The security police arrive up there and they give one poor labbie a ticket for speeding inside Site 300, but that's as inevitable as apple pie, isn't it? So another thing is when you go out to Site 300 and you're doing this modeling, you take your model and you want to now test it to see if your model actually would work before you go out to the Nevada test site to do a very expensive test. You would want to do a hydro test at Site 300. So you do it. You take your modeling, go through it, and then your codes to do this are called hydrocodes, which are hydrodynamics. Hydrodynamics is a branch of physics in which you inject energy into something and it converts that something into a liquid, and it behaves like a liquid under the shock waves and the pressures. And so a computer code that uses hydrodynamics is called a hydrocode. And these hydrocodes are being pumped out mostly out of the Megaton Group. And so one short anecdote, there are two major ways of doing a hydrocode. One is called Eulerian, named after the Swiss mathematician Euler, Leonard Euler. The other one is named after the French Count de Lagrange, called Lagrangians. In an Eulerian code, when you get your device, you want to test, and then you make a mesh. You make these make zones, and so portions of the device are in a zone. Then you do your experiment, you do your calculation, and you inject energy into it. And the energy, of course, hits the object, and it causes it to bend, compress, push, squirt, do everything else. And so in an Eulerian code, the mesh is there, and it has to account for any material coming in, any material going out. So it's that bookkeeping there as it tracks all the pressures in that. In a Lagrangian code, however, when you create your same mesh, but anything that's in a zone stays in the zone. So nothing leaves the zone. So as the thing is expanding, the zone expands. If that section gets squished or something, the zone gets squished. So in fact, the zone, your mesh system, looks like the object being squeezed. And this often, when things get very violent with a high explosive going off, sometimes it's so violent it can actually cause the zone to twist on itself, and that's called a bow tie. And when it bow ties, you have that crossover point in the middle, and that becomes a mathematical singularity, and it crashes the code. It just crashes the code. And the way that these guys would work is during the day, you were getting your codes, what we called generators. You would begin to generate your calculation to go. You'd spend the day doing that, but most of the real grinding, the actual calculating, went on at night, and then we had a thing called the pad, and each designer would write, I want you to write my code, do my problem at this time, blah, blah, blah. And everybody would put it in, and then the division leaders, group leaders would assign priorities, who's on the top of the list, who's on the bottom. And then the people who actually run the problems are computer technicians at the computer center. They have no idea what it is you're doing. They just know put this thing in and kick it on. And it's uncanny, but it always seemed that 3 o'clock in the morning is when the computer would crash. That's when your code would bow tie and would crash. There must have been a magical thing in it. And then you would get a phone call from the computer center saying, Mr. Ramos, this is Joe at the computer center. Your program just stopped. Do you want me to, you want to fix it? Now, they could have been, the guys are usually very nice. I mean, he could have said, hey, Tom, your dumb code, it doesn't work. What's the matter with you? But they didn't. They were very polite. And so you get up, and yes, everything was important. And so you get up at 3:15 in the morning, get dressed, drive back to the lab, go down, pick up your computer deck. At the time, you didn't have digital machines. Everything was run by computer cards. You'd pick up your deck, and you'd have to change the deck to untie the bow ties, if you will. And we had algorithms to do that. Then you take it back to the guy, and then he'd put it back in the machine, and then it would kick on again. And then you go back home and try to get another hour or two sleep before you had to then come back into work. So that was life. That was like in the design thing. So morale was always high, nevertheless. People were always constantly keeping this going, and everything was important. And that was life. Remember the movie Hidden Figures? I think it was called, about a lady working at NASA and all that. Do you remember at the very end of the movie, they show a brand new super duper computer? IBM had this brand new thing. Well, that was the IBM 701 computer, which is shown there in the thing. Well, we had one already here. That was old hat here. NASA maybe getting it. We already had it. And the way they stored information on a 701 was on a thing called Williams tubes. And a Williams tube looked like an old TV set where you had, the electrons hit the screen of the TV and they make little dots there, and that's how you see a picture. And that's how they stored information, is on the screen of these Williams tubes. And so, okay, it worked, but guys were taking their runs and they were running it, and they'd run the same program twice and they would get a different answer. And what the heck? And they kept looking at it, and what's wrong with the computer? And someone happened to notice that the computer would go awry every time someone opened up the door, because at that time it would be late in the day and the sunlight would come in and hit the Williams tube. And when the sunlight hit the Williams tube, it would screw up the memory. It would just shoot the electrons left and right, and it would screw up your calculation. So they had to take a big black curtain, put it over, hug it up to keep everything going. So more and more of the trials and tribulations of these days, but that was the exciting time for these guys. So that's kind of a little picture of what life was like, getting ready for these tests and coming up with your new modeling. So we're over the hump. We're back, the upstarts, as I call them. These are young men and women who took over, if you will. If you can picture Lawrence carrying a baton in World War II to get the country aware of an atomic bomb steamrolling towards us if Hitler got his hands on it. So too, these young individuals picked up that same baton to get us through the Cold War before Stalin or Khrushchev got their hands on it. And next week, I'm going to go on to now where they take the successes that they had with the Clio and the Linda and go on with it. And I'm ready for questions if we have any. Thank you.
Sounds like you know a lot in detail about the Hydrocodes and the 701, so I'll ask you a detailed question. When did the Fortran language come into this and allow people to write in a reasonable, high-level computer language?
Okay, well, Fortran is what we call a compiler. So before there was Fortran, in order to give instructions to a computer, you used what was called machine language. And it was extremely primitive. I think I mentioned this a week or two ago, where first you had to name the register, you had to name where each location of any piece of data went. A compiler is something that could automate this. So instead of saying, take this binary number, stick it in register number 6, and move it then to the pop, 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 all you had to do is say, add 6 to 10, and the compiler knew how to do that automatically. And Fortran was one of the earliest compilers, and it made its debut right around this time, right around the middle of the 1950s. Fortran became available. And any of the code developers, code writers, thought it was a miracle, because you could actually tell the computer to do something without dictating by every specific thing came. But Fortran came around, it was very successful, came around the middle of the 1950s. Yes, sir.
Two questions. One is trivial and the other not so much. On one of your slides, you had a name, P.F. Panovsky, and I was wondering if he is related to Wolfgang Panovsky at all.
He is one and the same. Pief was his nickname.
Oh, okay.
Pief Panovsky, Wolfgang Panovsky, was a German immigrant, came over, and it was Louis Alvarez, actually, who met him during World War II. Panovsky's uncle, I think it was had a technical firm down in Los Angeles, and Panovsky was down there, and Alvarez went to that company looking for help to develop a detector that could measure the yield of an atomic blast. And he got introduced to Panovsky, a young man, and Panovsky helped him to put together this gauge that was then used to measure the yield of the Nagasaki bomb, actually. So that's how the two of them met. And then Alvarez, when he went back to Berkeley, he grabbed Panovsky and brought him back up there with him. And then Panovsky then became a professor at Berkeley. And remember the MTA, that the first presence of the MTA was the accelerator in Livermore. Panovsky designed that thing. It was called the Mark I accelerator, and Pief Panovsky was the designer of that. He's a very, very popular professor at Berkeley. People loved him. He was that well known. Anyway, Panovsky then had enough stature, he had enough wherewithal that he was chosen to be the first director of the Stanford Linear Accelerator Center. So the first leader of SLAC was the same Pief Panovsky.
And a second question. So when Livermore was finally successful with the Clio and Linda tests, what was the reaction at Los Alamos? Did they feel threatened at all that now they had a rival that was as good as them, or was there a rivalry developing, or what?
Well, there was no rivalry developing. There was already a well-nourished rivalry already existing quite a bit. So but the rivalry, in my opinion, was more in the management areas of the two laboratories. That I think Norris Bradbury made it no secret. He did not like having this second laboratory pop up. I don't think he was inured to that much doing with competition and that. So there was already a sense of rivalry there, and it was kind of natural. If you get a competitive kind of situation going, it was there. However, in my own experiences and what I've read, what I've seen here, that rivalry was much more pronounced among the management. And when you go and look at the actual physicists and engineers doing the work, they were constantly writing up what they were doing, and these reports were going from one lab to the other. And you could see it, that if one lab would do an experiment that was new, it was bringing something new into it, it was not that unusual to see that the other laboratory would have a similar kind of experiment 6 months later that shows the same kind of idea. So yeah, there was a rivalry, but it varied. It was complicated. You had a lot of pride in your own work, of course, and you wanted to be successful. And so you were competing. So Los Alamos and Livermore were certainly competing with their warhead ideas, but that really got more formalized by the time of the 1960s and 1970s. In the earliest days, it was kind of a free-for-all in a sense that Livermore went out on a brand new, as I mentioned, with the Linda especially. This was unprecedented. This was nothing copied out of Los Alamos. This was extraordinarily different. And boom. However, after about 2 years, you start noticing that Los Alamos secondary stopped popping up, and they look very similar to what was happening with the Linda. So a lot of transfer of ideas, a lot of good. It was a good, healthy collaboration of that sort, as well as competition. Yes, sir.
First thing is your book's available. There's a couple of copies at that bookstore, the Town Center bookstore. Just so you know.
Yes, yeah, thank you, sir. And I also mentioned, some of you may not know, last night I was speaking to the Livermore Historical Guild and the Livermore Library Guild of the city of Livermore. So there was a few hundred people last night, and I gave a quick and dirty lecture on the book last night. And I'm proud to say that the History Center at the Carnegie Park, the building in the middle of Carnegie Park on 4th Street and L Street in Livermore, they just purchased 60 copies of my book. And so it'll be on sale there. And I promised I would show up for author signings and things like that. And I'm also planning to go visit some bookstores in Berkeley, for God's sake. I mean, it's on the cover, so I'm hoping some bookstores in Berkeley would the good students going to UC Berkeley may want to read about their predecessors.
So I have two questions too. One is, and you may not be able to answer these. One is, what made the Linda special? Like, what was the idea or two that made it so different than what had come before? And then the other one is, I'll give the second question too. In hydrodynamics, I guess, was tested out at Site 300. But if a primary is fission and the thermonuclear secondary is fusion, and they're not doing either at Site 300, what are they actually testing out there? What material, what are they doing out there at Site 300?
The first question, the Linda, what dramatically was different with the Linda over all its predecessors is its case. It had an incredibly different kind of case than had ever been seen before. And up to that point, anyone would have said, well, you need to have these old, big, huge cases. That's the only way it will work. And so the Linda was dramatic in this, that they did away with that. So there was a huge amount of computations was required. Well, now what are you going to do without a case? So that's the big single way I can describe the different. If I could show you classified diagrams, I think both of us were, wow, look at that, but I can't. Now, the hydrotest. The hydrotest, yes, you can't have a nuclear fission, you can't have an atomic blast going on in your hydrotest. So what you want to do is you want to mock up the model of your weapon, your device, as much as you can to make it look exactly the way a real device would. And then you want to see how well does it implode? Does it implode correctly? That is, does it compress into a single critical mass? And so what you do is you use a material that has the same hydrodynamic properties as the actual weapon would, but it will not explode into an atom bomb. And the things that they use, different metals, but one is called depleted uranium, which is all the uranium-235 removed from the uranium, and that's not going to explode, but it has extremely similar to the way a regular warhead would behave. And then the real artwork goes into how do you tell how well it was imploding? And so there were some extraordinarily clever diagnostic devices developed at this time. One was called a pin dome. That's where in the middle of your device, you put a device which had the very, very thin wires come out, and you put an electric voltage on it. And so as the surface of the primary was coming in to implode, as soon as it touched the thin wire, you would complete the circuit, and it would signal at that moment when it happened. So at that instant in time, you knew where that surface was, and now you have a whole bunch of other wires sticking out there, and each one giving its own signal. And when you integrate that, then it kind of gives you a picture of what the surface looked like at that instant, and it gives you a good idea of how this thing was imploding. And then at Livermore, they designed a really phenomenal device. They had a linear accelerator accelerating electrons, and then they would hit like a tungsten plate at the end. And when the electrons hit the plate, they stop. And when they stop, they release their energy in the form of X-rays. In fact, the original name for X-ray was Bremsstrahlung, which means breaking radiation. So as you break the electrons down, they take that energy and it becomes an X-ray. And then what you do is you pulse the electrons, pulse, pop, 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 pop. And as they hit the tungsten plate, then you get a flash of X-rays coming out the other end of the plate. Now, what you do is you have your device that you want to look at as it's imploding, and behind it, you have the series of plates, photographic plates, and they're rotating at precisely the same speed that the pulses are coming. And if you do it just right, each plate takes a separate picture of the X-rays, of each pulse of X-rays coming through. And when you put them all back together, you actually get a little movie, and you actually get to see the thing imploding. So there's a phenomenal amount of work goes into the diagnostics that were going on at Site 300, which makes it, frankly, a world-class facility. Site 300 is a world-class facility. It's hard to overstate to you how important that is to the defense of the United States.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for coming to our talk. Thank you, Tom, for another great lecture here.
Okay.
Just to note that Part 7 is going to be on Tuesday. not Wednesday of next week. So Tuesday at 12 o'clock, you guys will get the invites for the WebEx as soon as it's sent out. All right. Thank you so much.